Hello, buddy. It is I, Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, here with a Jmulls Explains episode for the day. And today's a big one. We got a big boy today. Why I quit WoW. And also, why I started and continue to play Final Fantasy XIV. A pretty hot topic in the MMO scene recently, especially with a lot of people's general dislike for the modern direction of World of Warcraft and Blizzard as a whole, and while a lot of people are also simultaneously praising and playing other MMOs and Final Fantasy XIV, and specifically Final Fantasy XIV because that's the game I play. So, for the basis of this video, I just wanted to go over, essentially, a trip down memory lane, if you will, and talk about my experiences, and what I found, and what I got out of World of Warcraft, and what I now get out of Final Fantasy XIV. So, let us sit back, relax, have a drink, and let me regale you with a tale, because it was a mighty damn good one. I started WoW back at the very, very beginning of Cataclysm. Before that, I played RuneScape. I was big into RuneScape, but that game kind of got boring after a while when you realize the entire game essentially boiled down to you clicking on one thing and waiting for the game to play itself. And I wanted something new to play, and my friend was big into a game called World of Warcraft. I never played World of Warcraft. I'd heard of it, but I never thought it'd be a game for me. But then my friend started telling me all these tales about his Blood Elf Paladin, and him being able to set an entire array of enemies ablaze with a single spell cast. And it sounded cool to me, and he started talking to me about Death Knights, being able to raise zombies from the dead and have them fight for your side. I thought that just sounded really cool. I remember him telling me that he played on a server, supposedly, that Blizzard forgot about, and that rarely ever got updated. And I remember him telling me that one of the biggest moments in the server recently was that a single tree got added into an update. I would eventually come to realize later on he was probably just playing on a private server, but didn't realize that, and thought he was playing on retail. But that was besides the point, because the stories he told was still so intriguing, so engaging, that you just wanted to play the game to have a similar experience. So I tried out World of Warcraft's trial version, and I played multitude of characters. I had a lot of alts even back when I very first started. But one of the ones that really stuck out to me was this troll rogue I played. And I remember questing on the Echo Isles and swimming from one island to the other. And I'm like, good God, this is a world, ain't it? And I thought it was just so good. I remember listening to Vol'jin and Garrosh argue, and I'm just like, this is for me. And then on retail, I went Alliance. I made a human paladin. And I remember rolling that human in the revamped Elwyn Forest as hordes of people tried to tag wolves and kobolds, put out fires, and if you went there at Cataclysm launch, you don't know the sheer number of people that were in Elwyn at that point. Good God. Have fun trying to be a spellcaster, trying to get a tag in there. It wasn't going to work. I was able to cheese because I was a paladin, so I was able to just click on a thing and immediately attack it. So after a few attempts, I was able to get the tag and be able to beat the quest and move out of Northshire Abbey. That was cool. And then later on, I'm like, hold on, this is Dwarven City to the north. I kind of want to go there. So I thought, in my infinite wisdom, that, oh, there's only a bit of water, separating Elwyn from Dunmoreau. Let me just swim there. So I found out relatively quickly that Dunmoreau was kind of surrounded by mountains. I would eventually have to hop back, but it was just like experiences like that, and journeying out into the world of Azeroth and finding new things that you didn't know about. Little nooks and crannies, little secrets to be had. The world was full of them. Sure, maybe you didn't get any power or anything, but even then, it was an experience. It was an adventure. And I remember I set up my own goal. My goal was to get a Death Knight. So I set aside a week of game time, essentially, just to have the sole motivation to get to level 55, because I wanted that Death Knight. And I remember falling in love with the story. I remember going into Red Ridge Mountains and meeting JJ Keyshawn. and getting the squad together there. I remember Westfall, Dead Mines. I remember all of these places, and it was so good. And then I remember rolling my Death Knight, standing with Arthas on top of Acheris. That was so cool, riding that Frost Dragon. It was just so good. It was just one memorable experience after another. And then I remember falling in love with the story and wanting to read the various books about World of Warcraft lore. I remember falling in love with the book Rise of the Horde. I just thought it was a really well-written book. I remember reading the book that led up to Mr. Pandaria with the Fall of Theramore, and really liking that book. I read that book in like a day or something. It was something insane like that. I even wasn't that big on reading at the time, but still. And I remember, back in Cataclysm, I found a guild when I was leveling in Sholazar. I got ganked by a Horde character, and then this human paladin swooped down from the heavens on a griffin, and he freaking obliterated this Horde character. And I'm like, holy crap, is that what you can do at max level? And he's like, you good? And I'm, yeah, I'm pretty good. Hey, do you mind if I join your guild? He's like, yeah, sure, no problem. And he sent me an invite. And it was an Alliance World PvP guild in Cataclysm, and I was a Blood Death Knight at the time. So, naturally, those two things go together like apple pie and milk or something. It was so good. I remember that guild because it was probably my best experience with WoW, was being in that guild with that group of people. And I remember, because that server had a community with it, even in Cataclysm. Because the Alliance wasn't that big on the server, but we had a formidable resistance to the Horde. And I remember I would hang out in Goldshire, not for what you think I was doing. Grow up. But what I was doing was I was dueling people, and I remember this one dude who repeatedly dueled me because he wanted to win. And I'm like, okay, let's fight then. And I would always obliterate this dude, because I was a Blood Death Knight, and the other guy was like a rogue or something. Like, you didn't have a chance in hell. Because whatever damage you did, I just healed it up with like one death strike. And then I doubled that amount of damage you dealt with a shield. It was insane. Literally, melees could not kill me unless you were like a holy paladin and just like outbore me or something. And I remember one time when I was dueling in Goldshire, a group of people came up and were like, hey, you want to head over to the Gurubashi arena for like a 1v4? I was a Blood Death Knight at the time, like, okay, yeah, sure, let's do this. You know, it was piquing my curiosity, getting my interest, intrigued, if you will. So we head over to Gurubashi, and I freaking decimate 3 of them. I'm talking bop, 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 and I'm just putting them in the ground repeatedly. They had like no gear on them at all. It was actually comical, and I was just smacking these 3 people around. Now, some of you may realize I said there were 4 people that challenged me. The other guy was a freaking holy paladin, so that dragged on forever. But as me and the holy paladin fought, the other 3 would come back, and I would just like quickly clap them up and obliterate them. And me and the guild, we would invade Orgrimmar. We took out the various Horde city leaders. We would actually have these events where we would camp out in this building, right? Just in Orgrimmar. We'd pick a random building, and we would just all fly into that one building, AoE the entrance, just see how long we could last. Kind of like a game of card zombies or something. It was kind of fun. It was just mindless, like, fun. Just like hanging with the boys and everything, you know? And I remember when Mr. Pandaria came out, and I loved that cinematic. I'm like the only person in the world that actually loved the mop cinematic. I watched that thing on repeat. I remember farming Thunder Isle, the Barons, yes, in 5.3. And I remember the Timeless Isle, because the Timeless Isle on my server had its own community. It had its own villains, because you could PvP your own faction there. It was freaking awesome. I love the Timeless Isle. Being able to farm various things, having areas where you had so many elites where you needed other people, unless you were a pro like me and you could sneak your way around to be able to get to where you wanted to go, but be able to do it solo. I love the Timeless Isle, and I love Thunder Isle. I didn't even mind the Barons that much. And I remember trying to get green fire, because I was a warlock at the time in Mr. Pandaria. I was a warlock and a shaman. But on my warlock, I want to get green fire. I rolled this warlock just for green fire. And I tried that fight, I want to say like 65 times, and then I finally got it. And it felt so good to get that green fire. It was like my first like real challenging encounter in the game up to that point. And it just felt so good to actually get that. And then I remember I remember loving the leveling, and then I remember literally nothing else. I think the game got so bad at that point, where I actually tried out Final Fantasy XIV for like 5 minutes back then, because they had this like trial thing going on for like 7 days or something. So I was in this forest city of Gridania, and I had a lance, and I was playing a lancer. And I remember thinking, oh wow, the world is so gorgeous and everything, but this combat's so freaking god-awful that I just like bounced after like 20 minutes or something. And I wouldn't touch Final Fantasy XIV for another few years, which is actually kind of funny when I think going back on it. And then I remember Legion. I remember Demon Hunters being boring as hell, and I will freaking stand by that. The Demon Hunters have never been interesting to play, except for maybe Vengeance. Havoc has always been a freaking snooze fest. I remember how awesome World Quests were, surprisingly. Yeah, I know, compare that to the modern game. We actually liked World Quests back in Legion. I loved the freaking Kirin Tor quests. Those were so good. They were so creative and so imaginative. I loved it when Blizzard just got wacky with the World Quest design. It wasn't just a matter of go and kill these things. It was them laying out certain puzzles for you to solve. And that was when World Quests were at their best, in my opinion. Not when they asked you to kill a bunch of mobs or anything. It's when they just got wacky and just had fun with it. And I remember how awesome Order Halls were, and how awesome it was after having played Death Knights and Paladins for so long to be able to have the bootleg Frostmourne toothpicks, have Ashbringer, and freaking Doomhammer. That was so cool to me. I loved that, and I loved the story of each of the Order Halls, and I loved getting the various mounts. It was a reason to want to play the game more, because you were wanting to play the game, because you wanted these various rewards, you wanted to see these stories for yourself. That was so cool to me. I remember Mythic Plus sounding boring as hell and never doing it, except for maybe like 3 dungeons. I remember Mage Tower wanting that werebear, and I remember the Frost Death Knight Mage Tower being the most boring thing ever, so I barely even attempted it. But I got that Fury Warrior Mage Tower, and I got that Guardian Druid Tower, and that felt so good, especially that Guardian Druid, because Fury Warrior was kind of easy, but the Guardian Druid one, that tanking challenge, oh, it was so good. I remember when I first started that freaking Guardian Druid one, I remember, like, after like my 3rd pull of it or something, I did an emissary, and I got freaking loofahs, which extended the range of your thrash. I think it was thrash or swipe or something. It essentially allowed you to cheese the entire first phase of it to make it significantly easier. I felt like I rolled the dice and rolled perfectly. It was so good. And then I remember hearing about BFA, and I loved the Zandalari, and I thought Cool Telos was pretty cool. And I then remembered Azurite Gear. I remember Essences being quite possibly the worst thing the game has ever implemented, and I stand by that. As someone who grew to hate World of Warcraft PvP, asking me to do PvP to be optimal for my class turned me off immeasurably. It wasn't just a matter of one piece of gear being slightly better from PvP than the PvE equivalent. It was a matter of Blood of the Enemy just being so good. And I'm like, no, this system sucked. And you wanted me to do it on every ult? No, that wasn't going to happen. And BFA was the first time I think I actively unsubbed from the game. I think it was. It was a little bit after... It was either a little bit after or before 8.2. It was around the time Essences came to the game. And then I remember I was talking to my friend about World of Warcraft and telling him about the World First race that were going on and all that. And I remember him telling me he played a game called Final Fantasy XIV. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that game. It was a game that had like the slow as hell combat, right? Like I felt like I was playing through a tub of molasses or something. I'm like, yeah. He's like, yeah, that's the one. And he kept telling me, oh yeah, don't worry, it gets so much better later on. I'm like, okay, I can buy that. And then I remember thinking graphically the game looked way better. And then I remember looking up a Dragoon from Final Fantasy XIV. I remember how awesome that thing looked. And then as I came back to WoW again, when I resubbed to WoW, I'm like, wow, this story is kind of garbage. You really wrapped up Nazar thing a patch, huh? Like a patch and a half, but still. There was something I liked about BFA's story. I liked Jaina's story. That really was the only bit I kind of liked. I liked the individual zone stories, just not the overall arcing story of BFA. And I remember him telling me, my friend, that Final Fantasy XIV story was so good. I'm a big story guy, right? If you couldn't tell from this channel. And I just remember thinking, oh wow, he seems really invested in Final Fantasy's story. You know, WoW just keeps fundamentally changing the storylines and the characters that I grew up with and I really came to enjoy. And they just augment them and morph them in such a way where they're no longer recognizable to be the characters that they were. Like Modern Thrall, or at least the Thrall from Legion, and like the Katatu Legion Thrall is just completely unrecognizable from the Warcraft 3 Thrall. And it's not just a matter of character development, it's just a matter of them changing him so significantly. Like Garrosh going from Cataclysm to Miss Pandaria did like a massive heel turn in wrestling. That was WWE levels of writing right there. Like he came in, did a Stone Cold Stunner, and just said, I'm gonna rule the world or something. Like a reverse freaking Elsa from Frozen. Let it go. He ain't letting it go. And then I remember, I remember the Night Warrior with Tyrande, and thinking that was pretty cool. So I went back to Alliance. I was Horde from like Mr. Pandaria through like half through the time I came back to BFA. When I came back to BFA, I think I went back to Alliance a little bit afterwards. And I remember just coming to dislike the Horde. I'm like, yeah, the Alliance is alright, but it's just more of my aesthetic. And then I remember having fun with my friend in Final Fantasy XIV, and I remember WoW becoming more and more of a chore to play. I'm like, what? Every time I would log in, I'm like, yeah, I feel like playing WoW today. I would log in, I'm like, what the hell am I, why did I do this? Like, why did I do this to myself? It was like a matter of, if you made mac and cheese, but you also had a taste for cotton candy, so you put a bunch of cotton candy on top of that mac and cheese, and then it's like, yeah, that sounded good in theory, and then you like, it's just in front of you, and like, what is this ungodly abomination? Like, what is this actual affront to humanity? And I remember when they started to announce Shadowlands, I remember disliking literally every system and knowing the problems they would all have from day one of their announcement at BlizzCon. And I remember Meaningful Choice. I remember liking the looks of each Covenant, but hating everything about them mechanically, except for maybe the weekly events. I remember then trying the Ember Court on beta, and getting bored out of my freaking gourd. I remember falling in love with the characters, the world, and the story of Final Fantasy. It was a new world for me to explore. It echoed back to those early days of WoW for me, when it was like, it was just you and this whole brave new world that you came to explore. Sure, there's elements of Final Fantasy XIV's world design that kind of put me off, that were off-putting to begin with, such as it was being more of an instance-based MMO than a completely open world one. And navigating the world was a bit clunky at times, like I admit that, but it was still a whole new world that looked way better in my opinion than the one in World of Warcraft nowadays. I didn't think WoW aged well at all. I remember falling in love with the gameplay of Final Fantasy. It was like around the time, because I was playing a Dragoon, right, which is the spear wielder in Final Fantasy. You had a lot of jumps and stuff, and it had a lot of dragon themes. And once you get to around level 50 or 60, it just picks up, and I fell in love with that freaking job. It's what they call classes in Final Fantasy, jobs. Basically, you get a class, and then you can upgrade that to a job. And I remember becoming invested with my character, because I had no need for alts. If I wanted to play a different job, I just had to swap my weapon around. It was that easy, and I also wouldn't have to level them up. But it was all on that one character, so you become more invested with your one character because you are spending more time with that one character. And I remember the end of A Realm Reborn and being blown away by the story. It was like if Game of Thrones did the Red Wedding, but even better. I'm not a big fan of Game of Thrones, if you couldn't tell. I remember the journey we underwent in Heavensward and the losses we sustained. I remember Stormblood and going on a grand quest to liberate Doma and Alamigo. And I remember being blown away by Shadowbringers and being blown away again by 5.3. And I remember thinking, wow, Shadowbringers is legit one of the best stories I've ever played in gaming, not just in MMOs. Final Fantasy, WoW made me think MMOs had a systemic problem when it came to storytelling. Final Fantasy taught me, no, WoW was the problem. And games that copy WoW's formula were the problem, because you can tell a compelling story. You can tell an engaging story in the game, not just in expanded media, but in the game. You can tell a great story, an engaging one that's emotional, one that's thrilling, in the game. And then, I remember thinking that whenever Blizzard announced something, the only thing I would think is, how are they going to make this worse than I imagined it's going to already be? And then whenever Final Fantasy announces something, I always think, how are they going to exceed my expectations this time? Now, I could just sit back here and explain why everything Blizzard does for World of Warcraft generally is a bad thing, and why I disagree with almost every design choice that game has had in the last couple of expansions. But I'm not going to do that. Because at this point, I genuinely do not know if the game is just bad, or if it's just designed for a different audience than me nowadays. And that, because I was never a hardcore player, I never did hardcore PvP, I never did hardcore PvE. I was always more of a casual. I like the basic things. I like doing some dungeons, doing some transmog runs, maybe doing some PvP every now and then. You know, the basic things. Just hanging out with people. But they can't even do that right nowadays. I just don't know what to think about with Blizzard nowadays, with World of Warcraft. It's just, you can only take being let down over and over and over and over and over and over again, repeatedly, without end, until you finally just don't care anymore. And I reached that point with WoW. I reached that point a while ago, to the point where I just don't care anymore. I don't care about covenants. I don't care about what Blizzard thinks meaningful choices actually are. I don't care about WoW's story anymore. Because it wasn't one big moment that made me just think I don't like WoW anymore. It was a slow, gradual burning out. And it was kind of like the inverse for what made me fall in love with Final Fantasy XIV, because I wasn't totally sold on the game when I first started it either. It was just a slow, ever-climbing build of exceeding my expectations, doing what I thought was right, and just putting out a consistently good product. While I fell out of love with essentially every part of WoW, I fell out of love with the class design, I fell out of love with the moment-to-moment gameplay, I fell out of love with the PvP, I fell out of love with the PvE, I fell out of love with the world, with the story, and with the characters. Those are all the things I fell in love with Final Fantasy XIV. I love the gameplay, I love the job design, I love the quests, I love the PvE, I love the music, I love the animations. You don't understand just how important the music can be when you come from WoW, because you never really had it there, and making fights seem more grand and more epic and more appropriate to the story, until you actually do have it. And then you just can't have anything without it. It's just so good. I haven't even talked about the music in Final Fantasy XIV. My god, it's so freaking good. That might be a video for another time. This isn't a video to say that I regret my time with WoW. I would, if I could do it all again, I'd do it all again. I loved my time with WoW. I love all the memories I had with that game. And I'll never forget that game, but it's time for me to move on. If you couldn't tell, I haven't uploaded a WoW video in a while. That's because I haven't been playing it. I let my sub relapse a few months back. And now I'm Final Fantasy XIV. That's my game. And I'm happy. And really, at the end of the day, with video games, this isn't an endorsement of Final Fantasy XIV, though I would endorse the game. I think it's a great game. It's mostly just a saying of, if a game you always loved no longer is a game you love, it's okay to find a new game that you love. It doesn't have to be a Final Fantasy. Hell, it doesn't even have to be an MMO. But it's okay to play other games, because that's important, in my opinion. And it's important not to just stick with a game because you have a lot of memories there. Because it's just as important to be able to make new memories. So thank y'all for this little trip down memory lane for me. This is why I stopped playing WoW and started playing Final Fantasy XIV. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe and comment down below if you liked the video and you want to see more content. I know I would appreciate it. Stay safe out there, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody.